Let's start recording. And Link, the floor is yours.
All right.
Okay, thank you. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Accounting Design Project. I'm Link Lisick from Virginia Tech. Thank you, Alon and Steve, for this opportunity for me to moderate this session. A few housekeeping items. First, I would like to encourage everyone to turn on their cameras, so that way there will be more active participation. And second, the format of the presentation. First, we're gonna give Alon 5 minutes of uninterrupted time for him to go through the paper, the big picture of the paper with us, and then we're going to start taking questions. If you have a question about the paper, please type in Q or comment or question in the chat box. You don't have to type in the whole question, just, or raise your hand so I can see you. And then I'll call your name to ask that question yourself, and then you can have a conversation with the presenter. Okay, so Alon, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you again for inviting us, for you and Stephen, for inviting us to present this paper in the workshop series. As the title suggests, we're going to talk about firms' macro disclosure when micro firms speak macro. This is joint work with Pil Sadka, who was a colleague of mine at Columbia, and we still stay in touch and work together, and his PhD student at UTD, Cameron Volstead, who is also a really great student. So what are we talking about in this project? So a starting point is to sort of take a step back and sort of the background for this paper is the macroeconomy and firm performance and the relation between the two. Firms' production networks have become increasingly connected over time. That's what economists are finding, and this is happening regardless of the size of the firm or the geographic diversification of the firm. And as a result, the firms have become more connected. And the macroeconomic conditions that the firm faces has become more important for explaining firm-level performance. So Gil and his brother Ronnie and Ayun have a paper that basically show that when you look at the relation between earnings and returns, right, the aggregate or the ability to predict performance, the aggregate earnings are much more informative to the firm's performance over time. The aggregate earnings are playing a bigger role in explaining firm performance over time, where the idiosyncratic earnings have become less helpful in explaining firm performance over time. And that's because of the increased connectivity of the networks over time. That's just a phenomenon that we observe, that firms are more connected, that the aggregate earnings has a bigger impact or relation on firm earnings than it used to, while the firm level effect has gone down. And that said, there really is not a lot of evidence on how this change in the macroeconomic conditions and its role in firm level performance has affected the firm's information environment. Because now there's different drivers that are driving performance. The question is, what do firms do? How does that affect what firms communicate or what investors consume in terms of information? And so we basically have two related research questions in this paper that we're trying to look at. One is, has the increased role of the macroeconomic activity on the firm's firm performance affected individual firms' financial statements? So when you look at the 10K, just as a setting for where firms are communicating with their investors, are these firms or are these managers discussing more macroeconomic conditions? Are they discussing macroeconomic conditions at all? And if so, have they increased the discussion over the recent years when we know that the role of aggregate earnings or aggregate performance has increased in terms of its role in understanding firm performance? And we argue that this relation is not obvious because on the one hand, it's true that managers may want to address the increased linkage between firms' performance and the macroeconomy. However, analysts and investors have basically been sort of conjectured to have a better understanding of macroeconomic information than managers. There's various literature streams that show that analysts are macro expert and have better macro information than managers do, and therefore by sort of association the investors. And so in that case, because there's other experts or there's other channels, right? If macroeconomic information is available through other channels, then the managers may not have to provide more macro disclosure. So we don't think that that's an obvious relation. And that's one thing we need to start off with and examine. And then conditional on the first research question, which we do find that they disclose more, what is the association between these macro disclosures and the firm's information environment? And when we say what's the association, we mean it's a joint test, because we're going to have a measure that helps us identify level of macro disclosure in firms, but that's going to be a combination of identifying the firm, in other words, which firms are more susceptible to macro disclosure, and whether they disclose. It's going to be hard for us to disentangle the two, but we still think we have what to say because we're learning about how this macro information is affecting the environment. So specifically, when we look at sort of the role in the information environment, we start with a natural place, which is the analysts. Because they're supposed to be macro experts, we think it's an interesting place to start. And also analysts are a very important source of information for markets in general. So we examine if the analyst forecast accuracy varies with the disclosure, which is again varies by the combination of firm type and whether they disclose. And we also then examine the role of analyst forecasts on information asymmetry, which has been documented in the past. On average, we sort of take a look at this relation between analysts revisions and information asymmetry. It relates to, is affected by whether or not firms are macro disclosures or not. So those are the two things we're basically going to look at. Are firms reporting more macro information? And if so, does it have some sort of implication for analyst accuracy, information asymmetry, one dimension of the information environment? And again, the one key thing that I have to sort of emphasize is that our measure will pick up, it's a joint test of whether the firm discloses and what type the firm is, because we're not going to be able to separate whether the firm is disclosing just because it's a certain type or whether that's the information per se that's being used in the market. So, I don't, you have a question or something?
Yeah, I'm just wondering that related to your first research question, that have you thought about processing and the conference call Q&A, so you know actually who has more information about macroeconomic conditions, either it's the manager or the external users?
I think that is something that we could do. We haven't examined the conference calls because we thought the 10K was a more natural starting point, just to see if there even is disclosure, like macro information out there, like are the firms talking about, and I'll show you the measure in a minute, right? It's a textual measure of whether there is more macroeconomic text, which sort of relates to more macroeconomic information in the 10K. And then of course, we could look at the conference calls. Now that we know it's in the 10K, we could, and I guess then that's a good point. We haven't thought about that, whether or not the transcript would reveal who's telling who is talking about what and who's asking the questions. I think it'd be an interesting color. Like I think it would be interesting, for example, if it's all one way that the managers are talking to the analyst, or it's all one way that the analysts are asking all the questions. That said, I don't think we can it won't ultimately let us disentangle if it's a firm type or firm disclosure, unless there's some really, I have to think about it, because I'd still end up with whatever happens in the conference call could be a result of the type of firm, or it could be a result of the disclosure itself, or both. But I do think it would add more color than with the 10K, which we're blind on. So conference calls may be one way for us to go. That's a good point.
I think the reason I asked that is I think previously you talk about your hypothesis that you are not sure firms will be willing to provide more macro information, or is because external users have superior information set already, so they don't have to provide that redundant information. That's conference call will be useful for that purpose, but I don't think it will help you separate the firm type from the activity you observe. Yeah.
Okay, that's a good point.
Yeah.
So I'll keep going unless there's another question. And so let's talk about, so then we talked about the second research question. And so just to get us all on the same page, what our approach is, we use textual analysis techniques to try to get at this information, discussion of macro or macro disclosures. And so it's similar to other sort of papers that have used textual analysis to identify competition or other measures. And so we go into the 10K and we do a textual analysis on the target words. This is not all the target words, there's a sort of appendix in the back, but sort of various words like gross domestic product, macroeconomy, macroeconomic, interest rates. And then we count the number of occurrences, and that gives us a relative mention of macro-related information in the 10K. And that lets us basically sort firms on the amount of 10K disclosure that you have, if you will. And then the way we interpret this measure, right, is basically we have one big assumption, which is that if the firm discusses the macro information, it's probably also affected by the macro information. That's an assumption. It's possible we could test that in a conference call setting. I have to sort of think about whether you said some more. But that's our primary assumption going into the 10K measure, that it's unlikely that a firm discusses macroeconomic conditions if their performance is largely idiosyncratic. So we view this measure as both a measure that identifies the firm based on the fact that it's disclosing, and can then test how much variation in disclosure levels.
Alon, Wu Yang has a question.
Wu Yang, shoot.
Hi, Alon.
How are you?
Good. How are you? Can you go back one slide?
Happy to.
Yes. So I have two questions related to the details of this construction of this variable. Now, so based on my understanding, you basically take everything from the 10K, right, and look at where do these.
That is correct. We haven't sliced the 10K yet.
Okay, so my understanding is that in some section in the MDA, there's actually a required session about discussion of financial markets, right?
Okay.
I think a great proportion of these words will be mentioned there, and it's kind of universal. Everyone need to talk about something related to that, right? So
I think that's a good point. I didn't want to cut you off.
Oh yeah, please. No.
I think it's a good point, right? We don't really know how much of this information is sort of mandatory or voluntary, right? Because you're basically saying it's very possible that in the MD&A section, I have to talk about it and it becomes. Now, if it's, I'll show you some evidence that it doesn't look to be boilerplate. Like we looked at the time series correlation of the measure. If it's mostly boilerplate, it won't change much over time, right? So the time series correlation of this measure should be really high. I mean, it'd be close to 1 if it was boilerplate, and it's not.
Right.
And the second thing is, I completely agree that there might be sort of an amount that is forced, but if there's some additional variation on top of that, then that's what we'll still pick up. And then it's an empirical question of, does it work or does it not work?
Right. Yeah. So excellent. So I think perhaps there's some difference in terms of discussion in that session versus some discussion in earlier part of the MDA when the manager is talking about, how their performance would be affected, something like that, right? So this is the first comment. The second one is, when I know you guys have an appendix in the end listing these words, right? But to me, to be honest, it's like a little bit arbitrary.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. Like the three of us brainstormed, a list of, trying to remember like where it is. I'll just go back to it. I'll start at the end. We brainstormed a list of words, and there they are. And I can get back to my slide.
Yeah.
And so this is kind of what we came up with. Are they the only words? No. If we're just, measuring the macro activity with bias, with error, then it's just going to be a noisy measure, and it'll.
Right.
If there's bias, if we somehow are missing words and creating bias, that's more of an issue. My gut is it's error, but I could be wrong. And if there's words that you sort of don't like, I'm happy to get any suggestion. Cameron is more the textual guy than I am. See, he's on this call. He's writing things down. If there's any words you don't like or any words.
No. I think I have two suggestions. First one is actually, I guess some of other textbooks may also have that. But if you go to look at this textbook by Russell Longhorn and Richard Snow, they actually
I can only look at Penman's textbooks. I'm sorry, I'm not allowed to look at it.
Yeah, so their textbook actually have a chapter and about all these different types of macro factors.
Okay,
That might be one thing. And another thing is,
this is a great suggestion. Thank you.
I think there is one big part which I thought is a very obviously is a macro factor, is which is related to the oil industry, right? The oil that
Yeah.
is one part. I mean, although there is a specific sector related to oil, but
Right. You're right. That raises an interesting question, because we're at this point we tried to do a measure that's more broad, that's like that
Right.
theoretically could show up in any firm. But you're right that there are some industries. I mean, we basically put industry fixed effects in, so we're not comparing it. We're trying to look within industry or firm. Depending on the test, we either have industry fixed effects or firm fixed effects. So we're doing as much sort of controlling for constant, countervailing or sort of, correlated variables that are not time varying that we can address. So you're right. We haven't looked within an industry. I think if we brought those words in, we'd have to sort of think about maybe within industry analysis, which could be interesting.
right.
So
Anyway,
nice.
I think all these are discussed in the chapter 3, so I can send you.
We'll look at it. Yeah, you could send that. That'd be great. I'm happy to look at it. I think that's a great place to start.
Yeah.
Thank you. I'm gonna go back.
Alon has a question too.
Yeah, hi, Alon. It's just like related to this kind of ad hoc list of the backup words, right? I know that you have data from IBIS World, those external factors. Can you easily use the list of external factors that are more related to macroeconomic conditions to start your list of a keyword?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't have a list of, so what Ayumi is talking about is we have another paper that's very related, well, it's not very, it's related, where we look at sort of whether analysts have an information advantage with respect to industry information. And we have a measure that we received from IBIS World, which had their quantitative risk measures for each industry. And so I think we definitely, it's something we haven't done yet, but we could explore, is using the sensitivity risk measures, the industry level quantitative measures of sensitivity risk, and see how it compares to our measure. But the measure itself is a bit of a black box. So it's not that I don't have any, and believe me, we've pushed on them as much as we can. And so we have, the 10-page write-up that they're willing to share on how this measure is computed, we have, but it's not enough. It talks about these kinds of things. And the only thing that I can think of that they talk about that maybe is not specifically here is consumer tastes. So I guess it's possible that we could add some words on consumer tastes. I'm not sure exactly what it would be, but that's the only thing I can think of, basically because it's a bit of a black box. The measure.
Okay. So that data is not that useful. They don't really tell you what exactly is the external factors.
It's useful as a
Okay.
validation or as a comparison to the measure we have, which is by definition not industry specific, and then we could sort of see if it lines up in the right way. So I'd expect our measure to be larger when sensitivity risk is higher, and that's something that we can check. But above that, I don't know how else to use that measure because I don't have, it's a bit of a black box. That makes sense.
So the other thought I have is kind of like, it's really depend on whether Cameron is able to kind of pull it up. Is that why don't you ask a machine to pick the backup words? So try to use like a
In
vector
sample
of
to predict
word.
data sample, machine learning.
Yeah, like the vector of text that can predict future GDP announcements or unemployment announcement better, and they use that backup words instead of a human.
Cameron, why don't we use bag of words? Cameron's silent, which either means he doesn't want to say or we can look into it.
Let me interject on this. First of all, I'm not sure we know how to do that, but the second thing is
I definitely don't.
I think what we believe is more likely going on is that the firms are disclosing betas or a sensitivity to an aggregate shock more than describing what the aggregate shock is going to be. And I'm not sure we'll be able to do that given how time varying we find it. You see, if you have something stationary and firms are kind of repeating it all the
That's a fair
time, you
point.
can learn. The fact that we have a measure, it surprised us because I thought it will be a firm.
Surprisingly time varying, yeah.
It's surprisingly time variant. So I don't know if this is going to yield the outcome that we want, because it seems to not be you see, these programs are great at capturing systematic stuff, or repeated, not systematic is like the risk stuff. It's kind of these repeated themes, and I don't think we have that. It's actually surprisingly variant.
Okay, I can send you a paper. Like I think Peter Kalay has kind of like this machine learning model, like identify textual vectors that predict individual firm stock prices. And you can use the same technique to pick up some of the words for different time periods that would be relevant for that time period. Because when firms talk about beta, they have to talk about the object, right? I'm sensitive to what, and that is the what you're going to pick up in your backup first.
Yeah, what we just interviewed
another
someone
paper.
Yeah, we just interviewed someone who's doing it. I just don't know what he did.
I think asset pricers has done some of it. I think since 2019. I think, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, Stephen?
Yeah, when I read the risk disclosures in the front part of the 10K, there's a hell of a lot of boilerplate there, and a lot of these words be flown into the boilerplate. I just wonder whether there's any way of discriminating between the words that are in that disclosure versus words are in other parts of the MD&A.
Oh,
This may be difficult to do, but there's the boilerplate problem. Yes, yeah, we're subject to macro risk. Okay,
yeah.
It's got to put that in.
So I completely agree, and we were definitely worried about the boilerplate. I have a graph. Let me just see if I'll just show it to you really quickly, because I think and then I'll come back to what I'm doing. So basically what we did was we looked at the serial correlation of this measure, because that was our best way to think about whether it was boilerplate. Boilerplate, in our opinion, would mean a pretty high serial correlation, right? Because it wouldn't move from year to year. And you can see that there's like a decent amount of, correlation that's below 50%. It doesn't look like something that is like really sticky. We do think that there's potentially surprising time series variation, which we think is consistent with this idea that we have time series variation in risk in betas. That said, it's a good thought. I don't know if I could use this knowledge to figure out which words are changing and which words are not changing. I know the measure itself is not as sticky as it probably would be if it was all boilerplate. That's the empirical test I have.
Mm-hmm.
But knowing that, I don't know if it's a different bag of words that changes, or it's just more or less of the same words. So I'm not sure I'd have to think about that.
Yeah, fair enough. Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you for these comments. This is helpful.
Yeah, Zihang?
Yeah, so hi, Alon.
Hello.
So I have a bit of question on, when these disclosures occur, because I kind of get the idea that probably, this disclosure happens when the macroeconomic condition is somewhat unusual. So for example, in 2021, everyone is worrying about inflation. So firms start to talk about inflation a lot more, right? So if you look at the recent earnings reports, virtually, almost, I would say probably 3 out of 4 companies start to talk about inflations. So maybe there is a correlation between disclosure and inflation, in the sense that, when there is an extreme inflation fear, that becomes a factor that companies can attribute their past performance to some extent. Right.
No, I think that's a good point. Beta has 2 components. Understanding, how the macro affects the firm has 2 components, as you're basically saying, right? There's the level of the amount of conditions out there that are sort of in play, and then how they affect me. And so clearly, when there's going to be situations where more firms are affected, and therefore this number will increase across all firms. I don't think that would negate what we're doing with it, right? This, because basically what you're saying is there's going to be periods where this thing is going to have a higher mean, and there's going to be periods where this thing is going to have a lower mean. And I think that's completely accurate. I'm not sure if that creates a problem with the way we're using it to sort in a panel, right? Because I think basically what you're, I think I have to think about whether this affects our text. Maybe when we get to the tables, it'll be more clear. Whether there is a common factor in these things, whether that's a problem. It's not clear to me. But I agree that there's going to be periods where all of the mean's going to go up, and there's going to be periods where the mean goes down.
Yeah, I agree, because I kind of read some papers in the economics literature where they try to measure this economic uncertainty and using texture data. And one of the motivation for their measure was that when uncertainty is high, people start to talk about it. And when uncertainty is low, nobody talks about it, right? So perhaps, so I'm not sure whether this is a measure of firm-specific sensitivity to, things like inflation, or whether this is more correlated with a level.
I think it's maybe what I'll do now is I'll move to, it's about 11:30. Let me move to some of the results, and then that'll sort of, now that we've sort of talked about the measure. So first of all, I'll summarize the main findings, and I'll go to the tables, and then we can sort of address sort of what we've done to address these concerns. So first of all, we find that firms do increase their disclosure. This measure goes up over time, and it's pretty persistent. In other words, it's not just the large firms, it's not just the geographically diverse firms. We find this systematic increase across various sorts. And then our firm year measure basically identifies firms whose performance is more related to macroeconomic conditions. We test this. So I'll show you some tables that show that our measure is correlated with the beta. We regress from earnings and market earnings or GDP, and that beta is associated with our measure. And then after we've sort of, both confirmed that our measure is not boilerplate and picks up what we think it's going to pick up, then we apply it to the analyst forecast setting, and we find that the analysts are more accurate in firms with higher levels of macroeconomic disclosure, which is something that we kind of intuitively thought for a long time, but I think it's been hard to show. So I actually think we have a good test for it, but we can debate whether that's new or not. And then the second thing is there's this, with respect to this literature about how analyst forecasts affects information asymmetry, what's interesting is that despite the fact that the analysts are more accurate when macroeconomic information is more prevalent or there's more macroeconomic disclosure, they actually affect information asymmetry when the macroeconomic information is low. So they're more accurate with respect to macro information, but that's not the information that people, the market participants need from them. Because even though the idiosyncratic is not, they're not as good at it, that's where their value is higher, at least the way sort of the reduction in information asymmetry works. So we thought that was an interesting finding. Just in terms of contribution, again, we think it's the first to sort of examine this disclosure. And so it's related to the aggregate earnings literature. And we're going to show that it outperforms other bellwether firm measures. So this measure, I think, in our opinion, has some interesting appeal because it's able to pick up time varying changes in macro and beta and risk, which is hard to do with the existing measures of bellwether firms because it requires a time series. That's kind of what we're getting at. Okay. So I'll skip this and let's just go to the descriptive. So first of all, we basically find, it has a mean of 1.47, a median of 0.95. And that basically means that there's about 100, on average, right, 150 words out of 80,000, which is comparable to the measure that Lee et al. Fung created for competition. It's the JAR paper in 2013. So at least with that sense, we sort of found that this is roughly how textual measures look, and so it's comparable in terms of its distribution. And then we go and we look at the measure. That's the first thing we're interested in. And we do find that there is an increase. There's a big spike around 2010 or 2009, depending on how you line this graph up. And so, yeah, it's going up, and it's roughly consistent with the increase in the role of macroeconomic forces on firm performance, with a relatively big spike around here, which could be sort of Xiang's point about, this was a time when there was a lot of macroeconomic stuff going on. But what's interesting is it's not just one subgroup. So we can sort here on the different quartiles of the measure. It's not just the largest firms with the most disclosure that are doing more. All firms are doing more. Firms that are in the highest level of disclosure or the lowest level of the measure, you see increases in the mean and in the median and in the standard deviation across all quartiles, which basically means we haven't just picked up some sort of increase in the bellwether firms. There's a more deep phenomenon going on here. At least that's how we interpret it. And there's sort of similar sorts on size. So it's not just the large firms. This is sorting on size, right? Small firms talk about it more, or smaller, I shouldn't say small, the first quartile of firms. In each quartile of size, you basically see that this measure is sort of increasing. And you do the same thing with geographic segments. So it's not limited to a certain amount of firms or a certain type of firms that are predisposed. It's a type it's a type that can exist in any size bracket or any geographic dispersity bracket. And that's what we talked about. This is our test to see if it's boilerplate. The time series correlation is not nearly as high as we thought.
Hi, Alon. So I think it's very cool. It's kind of like time varying, right? Because a lot of a 10K textual measures kind of like very sticky or persistent over time. But I think going back to Gil's earlier point, do you want to actually really identify whether they are talking about the sensitivity to the macro shocks, or they just simply during that period of time, there's a higher volatility of surprises regarding the overall condition?
I think we do care, and I think I'll jump to this test. I'll show you the determinants after, but let me jump to, okay, let me rephrase. I think if it's just all the firms talking about the macroeconomy sort of being more prevalent and if there's no disproportionate effect on the firms, then I don't think we've actually found anything that we can there's not going to be any effect, right? Because it'll just be, once you put in a year fixed effects, it'll just die, right? You're basically saying we have to make sure it's not just trends in time and in some periods, right? So we ran to test whether this picks up GDP and inflation, which is sort of what this discussion is saying. We sort the sample into terciles based on percent ag, which is our measure. And then we run this firm level regression, right? And this is sort of this is an earnings beta, if you will, right? Because it's how the earnings is related to the macro activity, right? GDP or inflation. And then we basically tried the same test for the existing measure of bellwether firms, which comes out of this is the jar paper that looks at the management forecasts and the sort of system, sort of bellwether firms. And this is what we find, right? So when we use our measure, as you move up across the terciles, the beta is going up and the R square is going up. And that's a huge jump in R square. I mean, that's very impressive. I don't know that we expected it to be that good. And so that to me is how we best confirm that it's a beta. It's that maybe there's other things in addition to beta. Our measure may also have time series variation that's just based on the level, but it's also picking up the variation in the beta across firms and across time. And
I really like this part. Yeah.
What? Go ahead.
I really like this table, but I'm just talking about like later on when you are testing different kind of like endless dependent variables, maybe you want to consider either a time fixed effect, for example, quarter fixed effect, or including those macro indicators as a control variable, right? So that your disclosure measure picking up the sensitivity part, not just the overall macro trend has become more volatile or changes that affecting all the firm. I don't think your paper wanted to say that over time macro condition become more volatile. You want to say actually firms using disclosures to conveying their individual firm specific sensitivity to that overall.
I completely agree with you. We're after a firm year measure. We're not after just a year measure. And so I still remember off the top of my head, we definitely use firm fixed effects in the analyst tests. And I think we use time fixed effects too, in the analyst tests. In the determinant test, we didn't use fixed effects because most of the identification is cross-sectional. In other words, this was our first pass at just sort of examining whether we think that the characteristics of the firms that would have a higher measure actually do. So we find that size is positively related to our measure. We find that book to market is positively related, which is maybe consistent. The number of geographic segments. So it sort of looks, institutional ownership is likely to be higher in the larger, more sensitive firms. One thing that we found interesting in the determinants regression is that we find that the ROA is positively related to our measure, in the sense that, sometimes you think that firms will use the macroeconomic disclosure to attribute blame for bad performance, saying it's not us, it's the macro, and yet that's not the relation we find. This measure still has industry and year fixed effects here. So we still do this with industry and year, and in the other regressions, we're either using industry and year or firm. I think we use firm and year for all of them. So I think you're exactly right. We do need to control for time trends. And if to the extent that we haven't, we need to fix it.
Alon, Stephen has another question.
Yeah,
Which slide?
What's that?
Which slide would you like me to?
This one's good, yeah.
Okay.
I just think another way of doing it, you've got this macro rest on these the operating income. Typically, we think of betas, sort of earnings betas, as betas of the individual earnings to the market-wide earnings, okay?
Fair point.
So you could think, look, let me get the earnings for the S&P 500 or whatever, price denominated, and let me get a beta of the individual stock with respect to that beta, and then see whether these macro disclosures actually are related to that beta. Okay, that would be another way of doing it.
No, I think that's a fair point, right? Our big picture idea was, is it the sensitivity of the firm to the macroeconomy? But a much more specific measure other than GDP and inflation would be aggregate earnings. So
yeah,
we could.
That's just a fundamental beta and an earnings.
Yeah,
beta.
no, I agree. We were so focused on GDP and inflation because we had in our heads macro. But you're right, aggregate earnings is a natural test too. We should do that.
Yeah.
Thank you. All right, so we have this measure, and it does. It seems to pick up this beta or this relation with the macro activity. And the bellwether firms, it doesn't actually do that. And we think one of the big things we're realizing is that this risk, this is time varying, right? This exposure to the macroeconomy for the firm is not sticky. It changes over time, and that's why these alternative disclosures. I'm sorry, that's not this graph. This is the next graph. This alternative disclosures doesn't work. So this is the alternative bellwether measure that was used in the JAR paper, and that requires a time series where they regress the time series of earnings on various macro measures to get basically an R squared, and they sort on the R squared. And so when you do that, it doesn't actually sort of sort the same way we would expect with the GDP, right? Their lowest measure is actually more correlated than the highest measure. The same thing with the inflation, and the R squares don't bounce around as much. They're also in the opposite direction. So our point is that what we like about, I'm going to sort of go back to table 4, what we like about our measure is that because it has the ability to be time varying and not only firm varying, it does a better job of picking up this relation between the earnings and the macro because it's a time varying measure. And so we think that's kind of an important point. Right, using existing measures for bellwether firms, we don't see similar results. The systematic risk seems to vary by firm and period.
Alon, Wuyang has another question.
Sure.
Yeah. And so I guess my question is probably related to Alon and Stephen's earlier point. So in my mind, actually, I think there are 3 parts that are potentially driving the results. The first one is like a change in economy. If there is financial crisis or whatever, that is make the macro stuff more salient. Second one is potentially there's change in the firms in the sense that nowadays firms are more connected to the macro economy. So is that kind of something my impression got from reading the paper. And third one, is that possible? They also just change in disclosure behavior, and nowadays, for whatever reason, firms just disclose more related to the macroeconomy, even if
Yeah.
both the macroeconomy and the firm's connection with the macroeconomy constant. So how do you think about that?
I think if we were holding this constant, we wouldn't find this result, but I have to think about it some more. I don't think the third interpretation that you're putting forward would work with this graph, with this test. But maybe I'm missing something, right? Because I can see you basically saying, look, in periods, there's three things that are going on. This could just be increasing,
right?
And then all the firms sort of talk about it.
Mm.
But then if that's the case, I don't think we'd find the sorting on the beta. You could say this is increasing, which is kind of part of what we're after.
Right.
And so I'm not saying, it's very possible that when this increases, that I can't disentangle. But if it was just the macro, if it was just the level, I don't think I would find our results. I have to maybe think it through. The third option is what you're saying is it's nothing about this. They're just talking more, right? So you hold both of these constant. I think if that was the case, and I think that is definitely something we need to think about and rule out, I think we wouldn't find this result. So that's why I think table 4 and 5 are very important. Well, table 4, 5 in the graph, because they help us rule out the boilerplate. They show that it's not just about the level of macro information, because then we wouldn't find the sort on the beta. And it's not just sort of, well, you randomly sorted, because when I use an existing bellwether firm measure, I don't find the same result. That's how I think about it. But we definitely should think about those three components, and it wouldn't hurt to discuss them specifically in the paper to say like, there's A, B, and C, and this is kind of how we view it. So I think that's a good point.
Yeah. Okay, can I ask one small, relative small thing? So as you just mentioned, like you kind of highlight on GDP and inflation, thought these are very representative of the macro conditions. Right. But in the keywords, sorry, getting back to the keyword stuff. So you have many of these things related to the financial market, right? Is the financial market movement part of the macroeconomy in your mind?
Yes.
Yes, right, okay.
I think so. I mean, when you say financial, so I don't view one bank being in trouble as financial, but I mean, if we think about the credit crisis, which was all bank related, that's definitely part of the macro, right? Because the whole liquidity dries up, capital dries up. I mean, so yeah, I definitely view, I mean, now people are worried about, it's not just inflation they're worried about, it's also borrowing rates, right? That's another issue that people, and then that affects cost of capital, potentially, and leverage. And so it can sort of show up anywhere.
Right, so the borrowing cost, actually, I don't think that is in the list, right?
No, we didn't. I mean, that's a good point. We didn't. So
at the end of the day,
we have interest rates and currency.
I see. Yeah, at the end of the day, is perhaps find some other sources, more complete sources of all these
the words
and yeah. Anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I think we'll look at the book. I think the book could be a great place to go, and we'll look at the textbook and that's in a place where we can compare our list to the textbook and take it from there, and then see if we can find other lists. I think we're open. I by no means think we found the perfect list, but I kind of flip it on its head and say, if I can't find it on my first pass and I need to supermine the list to find what I'm looking for, then it's probably not there. So I'm happy that we found it with this relatively first, brush, if you will. But that doesn't mean we can't refine the list to get more power. I completely agree with you on that.
Yeah, Young?
Hi, Alon. I think during your discussion with Wei Yang, I have this crazy thought. What if a term, or for example, facial mask or housing, changing its meaning over time? So before 2007, we talked
meaning over time.
Change its implications. So before 2007, when we talk about house prices, we may think it's more idiosyncratic, but like after 2007, that becomes a very macro term. When we talk about facial masks before the pandemic, it's more kind of regional culture, but like after a certain time period, the implication of a certain term has a different macro relevance. it's kind of like time varying. And then that's kind
Yeah.
of scares me a little bit when
No,
the
that's
term
a good
actually has
point.
time varying implications. Yeah. I don't know.
I
Yeah.
think that's a good point. I mean, I can tell you my gut reaction. I'll have to think about that. My gut reaction is that the more of that that's going on, the more noise our measure will have. Because we'll just end up thinking we're picking up macro and just picking up not macro. It could be a bias if I knew exactly what the alternative thing we were picking up is, that and why that's related to everything we find. I'd have to think about that. I'm not saying that can't be the case. Nothing pops to mind. So it's definitely possible. It sort of goes back to, like, we can definitely refine this measure. We could have a better list. And we could also sort of potentially, I mean, I'm not sure where I would get it, but I'm saying at least in context, like, the list is not perfect, then you're right. Another way to think about the list not being perfect is the interpretation of the words can vary over time. So my gut is that the measure is noisy, and if we did a better job, we'd have a cleaner measure and we'd find even stronger results. Whether there's a bias because of that, I don't know. I can't think of one in my head, but that doesn't mean it's not there. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
I have about 15 minutes, so a little less, maybe 14. Let me try to show you the analyst result too. Well, first we want to say that in terms of the implications, I think one of the implications of our studies is related to this idea of risky earnings, which Stephen has been talking about for a long time, right? We sort of have this relatively large literature, or not large, but a relatively growing literature that, earnings are systematically risky, and the reason that earnings ratios are priced is because the uncertainty related to the realization of earnings is priced. And I think what our study shows is that, it's very likely that there is this systematic risk, but it's going to be really hard to measure it in an alternative way, because it's going to have to be firm varying and time varying to get it right. So I think we support the findings or the idea of risky earnings and the uncertainty about the realization of earnings affecting prices. And we're actually saying it's not easy to measure this sort of exposure because it's going to be time varying. Now, with respect to the analyst results, right, assuming our measure is roughly what we think it is, this phrase, if it walks like a duck and talks like a duck, maybe it's a duck. Now the question is, can we find one application? I think there's lots of applications, but we wanted to use one in the paper, is the impact on analyst forecasts. So accuracy is an interesting thing, because while analysts rely more on public disclosure, generally speaking, after Reg FD, aggregate performance tends to be the things that they are known for, right? If you do portfolios of analyst forecasts at the industry level, you find better sort of results. And there's various, Amy Hutton has a paper that tries to show that the relative accuracy is higher when there's more macroeconomic activity affecting the firms. And so it may be that the accuracy of analyst earnings is positively related to macro disclosures. That's our hypothesis based on prior literature, although I think we have a cleaner test. Because what we're able to do is we're able to sort and then look at the portfolios. So I'll show you that in a minute. The second part of the analyst test is more about the informativeness, because I think one thing that's interesting is, sometimes information is more accurate. For example, in a different setting, when uncertainty is high, information is less accurate, but it could still be more informative and more valuable because uncertainty is high. So here, what we're trying to do is we're trying to measure the informativeness through the effect on information asymmetry between investors. Dan has this paper with Oded and Ed Owens that on average, analyst forecasts go down around the announcements. Information asymmetry goes down around analyst announcements. And the idea there is that an analyst, when it provides information, one of two things can happen. It can provide new information to the entire economy, to all the investors. And if you provide new information to all the investors, the sophisticated investors usually have a leg up. And then you end up having spreads go up in the short term around the announcement, and then spreads go down. And that's what we observe for various types of announcements, like earnings announcements and management guidance announcements. But for the analyst, they find that the spread goes down immediately. And so it's not that the analysts provide new information to all investors, but are more likely helping the less sophisticated investors catch up. That's sort of that's their premise, that's their finding, that's their evidence.
Alon, Lindsay has a question.
Okay, Lindsay, go ahead.
Hi, regarding your analyst accuracy result, do you have in mind that analysts are in real time realizing that these firms have high macro content using the same, way that you've identified it, meaning they're reading the 10K and saying, oh, all of a sudden this firm has high macro. So how do you think this is manifesting in analyst forecast accuracy?
So let me talk about the analyst forecast result, and then we'll get back to the information signature. So this is the result we're talking about, right? Basically, what happens is when we sort the observations by our measure, we find that the absolute forecast error of the analyst is basically the highest when the macro is low and the lowest when the macro is high. In other words, their accuracy is improving over time. I don't think I can't rule out that it's directly a result of the information that the firm is giving them, but I think it's at the first pass, the interpretation has to be broader. In other words, we think that our measure is picking up the firm does a good job of identifying the firms that are more affected by the disclosure. More affected by the macroeconomy. And these are the same firms that the analysts basically can use their knowledge to provide better forecasts. Why do they have better knowledge? Because they have a broader view, right? They view an industry as a whole and an economy as a whole, as opposed to just an individual firm, right? They're talking to multiple constituents, and their macro information and their industry information is a large part of the input to their model. So I don't think that the analysts are necessarily like looking at the 10K. I think the 10K lets us identify the firms that are both impacted and disclosing. And these are the firms that the analysts understand better in terms of accuracy, because there's more of that macro information affecting the earnings forecast, so that they have a better sense. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I guess. So what if you kind of like flipped it and said, let me identify the firms for which analysts are the most accurate. And then I guess coming back to this idea of like, what's the right dictionary to use?
Right.
Could you like use that sample to somehow like come up with what they're saying?
Oh, I see. So you're saying, let me find the firm where the analysts are more accurate, look at their 10Ks and see which words are.
Yeah, kind of like you're saying it's like this direction, but couldn't it sort of be the other direction where like if analysts are the most accurate for firms with high macro content, then those are the high macro content firms. In fact, if you looked at any like the firms with that where analysts are most accurate, would you find the same relationships with macro outcomes? Like, I'm just trying to understand if analysts are also good at identifying these firms.
I think the analysts definitely are good at identifying these firms, because they basically to project the earnings, to forecast the earnings, which is part of their job, they have to understand the macro to understand these firms. So, it's like they know the firms at a individual basis, right? They don't view it as one large data set. So I'm sure that they know them, they identify them, and then they use their expertise to be more accurate. I don't have a specific causal relation here. It's just that the analysts are more accurate in the firms that are more macro oriented. Is it possible that they're better because the firms tell them stuff? Yeah, it's possible. Is it possible that the firms are more macro because of the analysts? I don't think so. I think
probably not.
Prior to the analysts, yeah, just in terms of the direction. But I can't say that the disclosure is causing the reduction in forecast error. It's a combination of the firm type and the disclosure. That's a great point.
Alon, yeah, you have about 5-6 minutes left.
Okay, so last question, and then I'll try to just extend the last test. Go for it.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's a follow-up of Lindsay's question. I also puzzled by the direction and the causal language used in the paper. You talk about the impact of this on analyst coverage. So I think that's the reason why.
Impact of the joints, impact of both the disclosure and the type, not impact of one or the other.
Okay, I want to mention something perhaps is related, but I don't know whether it's an alternative explanation or not. Is that possible? These firms that are more related to macro is actually easier for analysts to forecast?
Yeah, exactly what I said.
Okay, so that is your story, right? Okay.
Yeah, that's our story. So maybe it's not written right. That's exactly our story. Firms that are more macro-y, that have the combination of, disclosing and potentially being more sensitive, because that's our assumption if they want to talk about it, if they're not more sensitive. These are the firms that analysts are more accurate in.
Yeah,
That's a
no,
hypothesis that's been out there for a while. We
Right.
just think we can measure it.
right. So I think let me give you one very specific example, right? So in my FSA class, I used the diaper industry as an example, right, to students, because for these firms, actually, it's very easy for the analysts to forecast the revenue stuff because it's highly correlated with the demographics. And
Right.
we have hundreds of economists forecasting all these demographic variables, right? So for these firms, it's actually just much easier to forecast.
Same idea. I love
Okay.
that example. Yeah, same idea. So just like if I was forecasting for the diaper firms, it's very easy for me to predict diapers because all I need to know is birth rates and demographics and whether they use diapers. Because you'd be surprised, not the entire world uses diapers, as I've learned. And then what I was saying here is these firms, because they're more macro exposed, more of their performance is driven by information that's available outside of the firm, and that's why analysts have an easier time forecasting, which is a prediction that's been around for a while. We just think this is a cool way to show it. So it's both a prediction that we can show plus a confirmation that we're picking up what we think we're picking up, kind of both ways. It's both new evidence and validation at the same time. So I'll do the last thing is I'll talk about the information asymmetry. So I started mentioning that the idea with the information asymmetry is that if the information is provided, the idea with the information asymmetry is if the information is new to everyone, then you expect spreads to go up in the short term as the sophisticated investors have an advantage, and then it goes back down. However, if this information is more about helping the less sophisticated digest things that the sophisticated know already, then you'll have the information go down immediately. And that's what Amiram finds in the original paper. So in the original paper, what they do is they basically use time dummies around the announcement and show that the information, that spreads decrease around this window. Now, what we did is we said, okay, that's very interesting. Is this more likely to happen in the firms that are high macro firms or the firms that are low macro firms? On the one hand, in the high macro firms, the analysts have more accurate information. On the other hand, as Young mentioned, this is outside information, like with the diapers, right? And so it's not clear that this is exactly where they're going to make things easier, because it's possible that other investors have access to this information, or the analysts and the investors together. So in other words, the analysts are they're not providing things that are helping the sophisticated as much. They're not playing catch up as much in the high macro setting. Maybe they're doing it more in the low macro setting. So it's really an empirical question about, where is this effect on information asymmetry stronger? And we find that it's stronger when the firms are less macro oriented, at the bottom decile of our measure relative to the top decile. And we find that this result is even stronger when in the period that our disclosures are more predominant, right? Because that's when there's a big spike. And then we test this various ways, right? We've also we did a double sort where we first sort on size and then sort on our measure. And so the measure is a combination of the double sort. And we still find that in the low level, where it's not just small firms, it's double sorted on size and our measure, that is still the place where the spreads go down, right? That's where you find this negative result on the period 0 and period 1 relative to the pre-period. And then we find the same thing when we do this by splitting the sample and by not using interaction terms. And then finally, we also find it using market responses. So the market response to the analyst is actually higher when there's less macro news, when the firm is less macro-y or macro disclosure. So I think I'm out of time, right? So that's why hopefully I didn't rush too fast. So we've shown that macroeconomic disclosures are rising over time. We sort of find that these firms who provide macroeconomic disclosures have a stronger association between their performance and the macro conditions. That's just an empirical finding. And then the high macroeconomic disclosures are associated with more accurate analyst forecasts, which is kind of intuitive because, as we discussed, these are firms that are easier for them to forecast. And even though they're macro experts, the value of their forecast seems to be higher, where there's more idiosyncratic, that's when they have this bigger reduction in spreads and help less sophisticated investors catch up. So thank you very, very much for everything. I'll just remind you that the next presentation is on March 10th by Oliver Binns, and we're going to talk about investment, inflation, and the role of internal control systems as a transmission channel. So we'll be talking about macro again. No, just kidding.
Well,
I'm looking
thank you,
forward to this.
Alon. Yeah,
Thank
thank you,
you.
Alon, for a very